Hello, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you may be. Thank you for joining us for Rabbi Silber's shir on Sefer Shemot. Uh, as usual, I'm inviting everyone to be a panelist. That way we can see your face, or most of us can see your faces. And you can unmute to ask any questions. Today, Rabbi Silber is having a little trouble with seeing our videos, just some technical difficulties. So if when you unmute to ask a question, you could first say your name so that he knows who's speaking, that would be excellent. As usual, also, you can put questions in the chat on Zoom or in Facebook Live, and I'll make sure that they get to Rabbi Silber. And that's all for me.
Okay, thank you, Maxine. All right, so this was in this series, this will be the last session, but we will continue in a few weeks and pick it up for another 5 sessions. And then, of course, in the fall, it's the plan. As Maxine said, I can't see anybody. My computer, for whatever reason, there's some problem with it. You may be able to see me. I can't see you. So, but hopefully I can be heard. All right, so we've been studying, essentially spent several weeks on the plagues. And we've essentially gone through, covered the first 9 plagues, the 9th of which is the plague of darkness, is Choshech. We talked about that. We talked about the next plague, which in a certain sense is a continuation of the plague of Barad, plague number 7. Plague number 7 seems to be the main plague. There are 10 plagues. Of course, the 10th may be the main plague, Makat Bechorot, which we should get to very soon. Probably as soon as we resume, we'll get there. But these 9 plagues are divided 3, 3, and 3. We've seen that. The 10th plague, the plague of Arba, is a continuation. And actually, there's something interesting that we noted last week about the 8th plague, which is Arba, the plague of locusts. And that is that in this plague, the previous plagues, reasons given for the primary reason given for the plagues, in a word, is that the Egyptians should know God. And knowing God took several different forms. Know that God exists, know that God exists in this world and makes distinctions between different peoples, different places. And then finally, before the last set of plagues, know that there's no God like me. That ain't kamoni b'chal haaretz. You may have many gods, but there's no God as powerful as I am. And all of that was lessons that Paro should learn, Mitzrayim should learn, etc. But there's no mention about anything that Israel should learn. Nothing explicit in any event. But in chapter 10, we saw last week that when you get to the 8th plague, the Torah says that God told to Moshe that I'm going to continue to bring about plagues, wonders, and signs, in order that Paro will, I've hardened Paro's heart, says God, to perform the miracles. And then in the second pasuk of chapter 10, as we saw last week, Ugeman tisaper biyoznei bincha ben bincha et asher hitalalti b'Mitzrayim v'et ototai asher samti bam vidatem ki ani Hashem. In order that you will tell your children, grandchildren, how I mocked the Egyptians, how I made a mockery of the Egyptians. Tell them about the miracles that I performed. And then the last 4 words, and you will know, vidatem ki ani Hashem. So we have that word to know, which is a critical word, of course, but it's also, it previously was about it's Egypt knowing, Mitzrayim knowing, and here in this verse, it's about Israel. So here for the first time in plague number 8, we have the additional reason given for the first time that knowledge of God, not just for the adversary, but knowledge of God for Israel. And we should tell the story over. This idea of telling the story is something that appears several times in the Torah. And of course, it's very central to our tradition. Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, Zechirat Yetziat Mitzrayim, which the Torah mentions in more than one place. So that's what we saw last week. And then we saw that in addition to the 8th plague, I'm not going to be over what we discussed last week, because that we did that last week. We have the eighth plague. Again, Paro initially is willing to relent, to let some people go. Moshe insists that everybody has to go. Paro says no way. And Paro's heart, once again, is hardened in the 20th pasuk of chapter 10. And then we have the plague of darkness, which we spoke about. The ninth plague, we talked about the plague of Choshech, the significance of Choshech, the fact that in the covenant with Abraham in chapter 15, when Abraham is informed about the price that Israel has to, or his descendants will pay for entering into the covenant, that over Abraham came a great darkness. And we spoke about that the suffering of Israel, the Geirut, the Avdit, and the Inui, one might say the setting is the setting of darkness. One might even say that the Torah is suggesting that Geirut, Avdut, and Inui equal darkness. And since the Geirut, Avdut, and Inui have been imposed upon Israel by Mitzrayim, and it's a kind of midah keneged midah, quid pro quo, it's only appropriate that Mitzrayim should experience the darkness, which is the previous ninth plague, and also that they can't leave their houses for 3 days, which once again speaks to the fact that Israel is not allowed to go into the desert, 3-day journey into the desert to serve God. That's as far as we got last week. I wanted to continue now, very brief chapter 11, a very short chapter, and then to talk a little bit about what is coming next and the way that the Torah tells its story and the order of the events that the Torah presents to us, which in itself is an interesting thing to look at. So let's all begin now with chapter 11. I can't see anything, but hopefully I can hear what you'll be saying and you'll hear me. So chapter 11, I'm beginning with chapter 11 in the first pasuk. Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, od nega achad, avi al Paro v'al Mitzrayim, achreichein yishalach etchem mizeh. Kishalcho, kala garesh yigaresh etchem mizeh. So God said to Moshe, I will bring but one more plague upon Paro, upon Mitzrayim. He will let you go from here. Mizeh. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. Now, let's begin with a simple question. Where is Moshe being told this? Where is Moshe being told this? Because in the end of chapter 10, Moshe is speaking to Paro, because Paro said to Moshe, towards the end of chapter 10, after the plague of darkness, in chapter 10, in the 24th pasuk, Vayikra Paro el Moshe. That's when Paro says to Moshe, V'chu ivdu et Hashem. You can serve your God. Rak sonchem uvekarchem yitzad, but you have to leave the cattle behind. Gam tabchem yelekim mochem. You can take the children as well. He earlier had said only the older people, not the children. Here he agrees with the children. But Moshe doesn't accept that offer. Vayomer Moshe, Gam ata titein b'yadenu zvachim v'yolot v'yosinu Hashem Eloheinu. So Moshe says, no. Not only do we demand to have animals, but you yourself will give us the animals for the sacrifices. And Moshe mentions 2 kinds of sacrifices. Zvachim, those are offerings that the one who brings it eats part of it. It's called sometimes the zevach shlamim, and burnt offerings, where the offering is wholly consumed. You give us. When our cattle also has to go. Lo tisha'er parsa, no hoof shall remain behind. Everything has to go, people and animals. Those animals will be used to bring sacrifices to our God. And then Moshe adds, because we don't know how we will serve our God until we go there. Till we come to the place, we don't know exactly how many sacrifices, what kind of sacrifices. Therefore, we have to bring the animals as well. So he insists that everything has to go, not just the people. not just the people, but even the possessions as it were, and all that is required to bring the sacrifices. And Paro doesn't accept that. So Paro refuses. I mentioned several times this idea of we don't know how we'll serve God till we arrive there. That's something which I think is quite foreign, probably to most of us. Get up, say Shabbat morning, you decide to go to the Beit Knesset, you're going to go to shul, whatever synagogue one prays in. And I think it's pretty safe to say that we have a pretty good idea what's going to take place in the synagogue. Most synagogues have very few surprises. Sometimes the rabbi's sermon, we're not sure what the rabbi's going to say, but in terms of the actual service, we're pretty sure what's going to happen. Not only that, we're even pretty sure what time we're going to finish. And this is different. Moshe says, how do we know? We're going to serve God. We have no idea exactly what's going to transpire. But in any event, Moshe insists on everybody, everything as a full community, it's not just the people, the possessions as well. We of course, we remember, I mentioned this last week, that in the Joseph story, it says when Yosef was permitted to leave to bury his father, he took his brothers with him, but the cattle and the children remained behind. And that's the same idea, basically, that Joseph can go, but Paro wants to make sure that Joseph returns. So we have a very parallel story over here with this Paro. And Paro says, Paro does not permit this. And now we come to the last two psukim of chapter 10, which lead us into chapter 11. Vayomer Paro lech me'olai. Paro says, leave. Hishamer v'cha, be careful. Al tosef ra'ot panai. Do not anymore come to see my face. Ki biyom ra'otcha panai tamut. For on the day you come to see me, ra'ot panai, you will die. You'll die. Vayomer Moshe, Kain dibarta, lo osif od ra'ot panecha. Moshe says, I hear what you say. I will never again come to see you. That's the end of chapter 10. The very expression which appears several times, ra'ot panim, riyat panim, that's an expression that we're very familiar with from the Chumash in terms of seeing God, the pilgrimage to God. Shalosh pamim b'ashana yera'eh kol zkurcha et pnei Hashem. We're familiar with that phrase. It appears several times in the Torah. Here it appears, Paro speaking about himself, you may not come l'ra'ot panai. Right? And Moshe says, okay, I won't. I'll never see you anymore. And this raises the problem that the Ramban asked the question, but I think it's an obvious question, which is that in the beginning of chapter 11, in the pasuk we started with this morning, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, od nega echad avi el Paro al Mitzrayim, achrechen yishalach etchem mizeh, etc. This statement that God is speaking to Moshe, where is God speaking to Moshe? Now, the point is that this speech over here in chapter 11, for example, if we skip down to verse number 4, we'll get back to verses 2 and 3, but in verse number 4, Vayomer Moshe, Ko Amar Hashem, and Moshe said, thus says the Lord, Ko Amar Hashem. We're very familiar with that expression. Kachatzot halaylu aliyot say b'toch Mitzrayim. Let's say towards midnight, I shall go out in Mitzrayim, umei kol b'chor, etc. And the firstborn will die. And he goes on, and Israel will not be afflicted with this. And then verse number 8, V'yardu kol avodecha eila elai. And your servants will come to me, says Moshe, and they'll bow down to me, and they'll say, leave, then I will leave. Vayetzei me'im Paro b'chariyah, at the end of verse number 8, and he walked out from Paro in great anger. So where is God speaking to Moshe in chapter 11? It sounds like God is speaking to Moshe in chapter 11 when Moshe is still standing before Paro. That's what it sounds like. And Paro had said, do not come to see me again anymore. If you come back to see me, you will die. But we have this whole speech in chapter 11, and then Moshe walks out in anger. It doesn't sound like, simple reading of it, does not sound like this happened on a different occasion. It sounds like it's happening right there on the spot. In other words, it sounds like that God is speaking to Moshe when Moshe is still in Paro's presence. And that's actually a very interesting point, because earlier, and the commentaries picked this up, that when Paro had asked Moshe to pray for him in the seventh plague, it says that Moshe leaves Paro's presence and Moshe prays. The commentaries noted that actually Moshe would not pray inside Paro's palace. Moshe walks out, maybe he walks even out of the city, he walks out of the metropolis, and he prays over there. But here, actually, what's interesting is here we have God actually speaking to Moshe, it would appear, even within the palace of Paro. And Moshe then, presumably, what God says to Moshe is what Moshe says to Paro in the continuation of chapter 11. That's how the Ramban understands it. And I think that is the simple reading. And it's actually very interesting, because Paro said, you can't come anymore again. You won't come back to me again. Okay. So that's the setting to the story over here. And now let's go back to the beginning of the chapter. Moshe says, Hashem says to Moshe, and presumably what God says to Moshe, Moshe repeats to Paro.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Is Lech Me Alai much stronger than Lech? I mean, I don't think
so.
we haven't encountered Lech Me Alai before, as far as I remember.
I would have to check about that, but yes, I think it's what he's saying is very clear. Get out of here, he's saying.
Get out of my face.
Get out of here and never come back. And if
Right.
you do come back, then you will die. He makes that very clear. The repetition of Al Tosef Ro'od Panai, which I'll come back to in a few minutes, and Lo Osif Od Ro'od Panecha, I think Lech Ma'alai is stronger. And so the sense of it is clear. Paro says, we've had enough conversation. This is the end. We've reached an impasse, and I'm not going to make any further concessions. The last concession he made was, you can take all the people. And Moshe says, not only do we need the people, we need the animals. And not only that, you should give us your own animals in addition. Somewhat a bit of chutzpah over there. So they've reached an impasse. So get out and don't return. Conversation has been completed. I do think that Lech Me Alai is get away from me. I think it is stronger. Well, let's come back for a moment to the beginning of chapter 11. Just have a couple of little comments I'd like to make. Number one, in the first verse of chapter 11, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe od nega achad avi el Paro. I will bring upon Pharaoh one more plague. The word in the Hebrew is nega. Now, what's actually very interesting is we've discussed the so-called 10 plagues. We've called them 10 plagues. But in point of fact, if you look back at the first 10 chapters of this book, the word nega never appears. This is the first time we have the word nega. And what makes that actually very interesting is that we did encounter the word nega in a different place, also relating to Paro. And that is in this parallel story that we saw in the book of Bereshit, chapter 12, when Avram goes down to Mitzrayim with his wife Sarah. And Paro takes Sarah after Avram says she's my sister. So Paro grabs her. And the Torah says, Vayinaga Hashem et Paro, Nigaim Gedolim V'et Beito, Al Devar Sarai Eshet Avram. In the story that prefigures the story of Bnei Yisrael in Mitzrayim, namely, Avram going down to Mitzrayim, Pharaoh taking Sarah, God visiting the plagues upon Pharaoh, Abraham being thrown out of the land, Abraham living with a lot of wealth, which of course completely parallel to our story over here. There we had twice the word nega, but the Torah has not used the word nega till now. When it comes to the 10th, which is going to be Makat B'chorot, here it's interesting that the Torah does use the word nega. in the ultimate plague, here we have the word nega. So it does again. The Torah now is what again brings us back to the story of Abraham and Sarah and the first descent into Egypt, and of course, Avram is able to leave Mitzrayim with great wealth, no less, and he returns. So here the Torah is already setting up for us what is going to happen next in the story, namely what we call the Exodus from Egypt. The point number 2 is that when Hashem speaks to Moshe in the first pasuk, there are different words used over here describing the Exodus from Egypt. So first of all, Paro is going to Yishalach. The word that we've seen over and over again is the word Shalach. Shalach ami v'yavduni, etc. But here, in verse number 1, we have 2 other terms that are interesting. Apart from Yishalach and Kishalcho, we have Kala. He will totally, Kala. Here they translate indeed, but Kala is completely. And we have the term Garesh Yegaresh Etchem Mizeh. He will Garesh Yegaresh. Gerushin is divorce. He will completely, he'll throw you out. In other words, the idea of Garesh is stronger than then just to send away. And we encountered that earlier in the Torah, if you remember. We encountered that in the Torah when the human being has been banished from the Garden of Eden. Vayishalcheyu Hashem migan Eden. Vayishalcheyu, and Vayigaresh et ha'adam. He threw out Vayigaresh. He threw out Gerushin. He threw out Adam, and Adam will never return to the Garden of Eden. So this, what God is saying to Moshe is, He's going to send you away, but it's also true that Garesh Yegaresh Etchem Mizeh. I just wanted to, in thinking what happens later in the story, I just wanted to make a comment about these 2 different descriptions of the Exodus from Egypt. And that is, and we'll come to this hopefully as we continue our learning together in the next phase, but actually when after the plague of the Bakat Bechorot, the killing of the firstborn, so there the Torah says the firstborn are dying, and the Torah describes the response of Paro and the response of the Egyptian people. The response of Paro, that's found in chapter 12, verse number 31. In verse 31 of chapter 12, it says, Vayikrogu Moshe uli Aaron Laila. Paro called for Moshe and Aaron in night. So it takes place at midnight. So Paro calls for Moshe and Aaron. Vayomer kumu tzu mitoch hami gam atem gam bnei Yisrael ulchu ivdu et Hashem kedaberchem gam sonchem gam bekarchem kechu kasher dibratem volechu uveirachtem gam oti. Now that verse, Paro says to Moshe and Aaron, you can take it whatever you want to be for. You can the older people, the men, the women, the children, even the cattle. Remember, he had said earlier, we just saw before, you don't need the cattle. Take the cattle as well. And not only that, bless me also. Moshe had said to Paro, you also will give us cattle. Sounds like, and give me a bracha also. So that's what Paro says in chapter 12. One might say he's agreeing to the terms that Moshe states in chapter 10. But then you have the next verse in chapter 12, verse number 33. Vatechezak Mitzrayim ala'am l'maher v'shalcham min haaretz ki amru kulanu meitim. Says the Egyptians Vatechezak. Here they translate urged, but maybe one might even say overpowered the people to leave. They said, we shall all be dead. And my thinking is, and I think this is, one could disagree with this, but it strikes me that the way the Torah describes the Exodus, what strikes me is that there's a difference between Paro on one hand, later on in chapter 12, and the Egyptian people. Because all Paro said to Moshe was, I now agree to all of your preconditions. You want the men, the women, the old, the young, and the cattle. Even I'll give you some cattle. But Moshe had never explicitly said, we plan not to come back. He never said that. Paro suspects him of that, and we discussed, was that Moshe's plan? I suggested that was not his initial plan. Eventually, he's going to leave. So what Paro is not saying you're out of here for good. Paro is saying, I agree with your previous request. But that's not true of the Egyptian people. The Egyptian people overpowered the Jews, saying, "Get out." And because they said, as long as you're here, we're all going to die. They don't want them back. They want to send them away. And I think there's further evidence that for the Egyptian people, as opposed to the Pharaoh, are responding to the situation very differently. For Paro, it's not clear at all, in my opinion, that he says you can leave and never have to return. He never said that. He suspects they're not going to return, but he doesn't give them permission to do so. Whereas the Egyptian people, I believe, actually are giving them permission to leave. And I think this is borne out by what we see next in chapter 11. So let me just read a few more verses, then I'll stop, and I'll be happy to try to answer any questions or comments or whatever that you raised. Unfortunately, I can't see anybody on my screen for some strange reason. I don't know. But now we have the next verse. Back to chapter 11, and then I'll stop after a couple of minutes and take comments and questions. God says to Moshe, please speak to the people. And speak to the people. They should request. I translate v'yishalu as request. The English that we have from the JPS is to borrow. Now, later in the Chumash, lish'ol means to borrow. The commentaries here, there's a commentary ascribed to Rabbeinu Hananel who says, here it does not mean to borrow. Here it means to ask for a gift. So the Rashbam says the same thing. I think the pshat is that way, actually, although later on, lish'ol means to borrow, borrow something you're going to return later. But let's assume not so. You should request from your neighbor, a woman from her friend, silver and gold vessels. Vayitein Hashem et chei na'am b'yeinei Mitzrayim, and God will v'yitein, and God will cause the Egyptians, people, to see Israel favorably, right? God will do that. Gama ish Moshe, or God caused the Egyptians to see Israel favorably. Chei na'am. Gama ish Moshe gadol miyod b'eretz Mitzrayim, b'yeinei avdei Paro, Moshe himself was seen as a very big person, both on the part of Pharaoh's servants and also the people. I want just to make one comment about this business of requesting gifts from the Egyptians. Again, my instinct is to side with the Rabbeinu Hananel and the Rashbam. I know there's an apologetic here, one can read it otherwise, but I actually think they're asking them to give them gifts. And the point is, the Chumash emphasizes that the people are seen so favorably that they are given these gifts. I mean, it strikes me that that very statement, they're seen favorably, and they're given the gift, and they're given these objects, the vessels, makes a lot more sense if what they're asking for is gifts, as opposed to simply borrowing something that's going to be returned later. It strikes me that chei na'am makes more sense. The very statement, they were seen so favorably, they were given these objects, makes more sense if lish'ol does not mean to borrow. But lish'ol means to ask, to be given. The Rabbeinu Hananel here, or at least the parish cited in the name of Rabbeinu Hananel, actually asked the question, why would they even, what is the point of asking for these gifts, for the silver and the gold vessels? Later it talks about garments as well. What am I saying? What is propelling the Israelites to ask for these things? And Rabbeinu Hananel suggests two possibilities in his commentary. Interesting. One of them, he says, is what they're asking is, what am I saying, reparations. In other words, they were slaves. They were working for nothing all these years. Apart from the fact they were beaten and all that, but they were working for nothing. That these gifts, the klei kesef and the klei zahav, etc., are payment for services rendered in the past. That's one possibility he suggests. And then he suggests another interesting possibility. He points us to psukim in the book of Devarim. In Sefer Devarim, It talks also about slavery, about slaves, Hebrew slaves that work for 6 years maximally. And there the Torah says that when you free your slave at the end of 6 years, you should not let the slave go empty-handed. But ha'anek ta'adikro, give the slave some kind of benefit. Ha'anek ta'adikro, it describes the gifts you should give to the slave. And that is not payment for services rendered, not at all. In fact, the slave may even have voluntarily made himself or herself a slave. That's a different point. The point being that when you leave the slavery, the master is obligated to give the slave, the now free person, all kinds of gifts to set the person up with enough finances, enough support, that they won't have to sell themselves as a slave again. People sold themselves as slaves very often because they had no money, out of poverty. That typically was the reason people became slaves. So the Torah says, when you free your slave, what does it mean to free somebody if they're penniless? They'll be a slave again later. You have to, when you have a deal with them, when you free them, you have to free them and have an opportunity. What you want to make sure is that they're not going to fall back into slavery. One way to do that is what's called ha'anaka. So the Rabbeinu Hanano, right here on the spot, mentions these two different possibilities. One is some kind of reparations or payment for the forcible slavery that the Hebrews didn't volunteer to be slaves. They were enslaved. That's one possibility. Another possibility is what we have later on. He says that when you free the slave, it traditionally, so and so in our tradition, you're supposed to give the slaves the means to make sure they are independent. The reason I mentioned this, and I'll stop and take any comments or questions, is that it strikes me that the Torah says, God instructs, tell the people to ask their friends, tell the people to ask their neighbors. When the neighbor gives you the gifts, okay, especially if we see it in terms of not just payment for past services, but the gift given to the newly freed slave. The whole idea of giving the gift is to make sure you're never a slave anymore. And it strikes me that that's the people, that what you have over here is exactly representative of what we have later. When it comes to Paro, in Paro's head, they're not 100% free. Yes, whatever you wanted before, you can go away, you can serve your God. He suspects they run away, but he never actually frees them. Whereas the Egyptian people are different. First of all, they want no part of this. We already saw amongst his own servants that they're getting very upset with Paro. Don't you realize that? What are you persisting for? So it strikes me that when God says to Moshe, they will send you away and then Goresh ye Goresh, that the way it actually plays out in the Chumash later is, as far as Paro, it's sending away. But as far as the Egyptian people, it's Goresh ye Goresh. And let me stop for a moment at this point. And anybody has any comments or questions, please speak up. I can't see anybody, but
Rabbi Silber, it's Gail Novetsky. So
yes.
I thought that they lived in Goshen. Who are these friends? I thought they weren't. They were living amongst the Egyptians. And how can we describe our enslavers as friends anyway?
Well, I'm not sure, right, that's a good question. First of all, in terms of your second point, it is very striking that the term Beit Riyuta is used. I actually wondered about this in terms of two things. First of all, let's remember that in Sefer Devarim, which admittedly is a separate book, but in Sefer Devarim, which talks about what nations you can intermarry with and what nations you can't intermarry with, so Ammon and Moab, you can never marry them. But when it comes to Mitzrayim, the Torah says, Lo tita'ev Mitzri ki ger hayita b'artzo. We don't totally despise the Egyptians. You are a stranger in your land, and the third generation Egyptian, the Mitzri Shlishi, you are permitted to marry. So in Sefer Devarim, it's interesting, you get a little different perspective. That's number one. Number two, I'm wondering actually if there isn't a difference between the men on one end and the women on the other. The men are running the country, the men are enslaving the Hebrews. But I wonder about the women, actually. I wonder about the women who weren't taken as slaves necessarily. I mean, Paro wants to capture them and take them. but I'm wondering whether there isn't a difference between the men on one hand and the Isha Me'esh Uta. That, even in the most terrible situations that we've ever had in Jewish history, it's not that every single person was out to kill us. Even in the Shoah, there were some Jews that were saved by families that were willing to risk their lives. There were some religious Christians who saved Jews for whatever reason. It's never black and white. I mean, your point is well taken, but in point of fact, that's what the Chumash says. So I had thought about perhaps the difference between the women who, on one hand, are less politically motivated, and maybe just more human, and they share something in common. And again, we have the psukim there in the Sefer Devarim, Lo teta'ev mitzri ki ger hayita b'yartso. That's what I would say. The question is a good one. I'm also wondering whether perhaps there's even a play on one hand, Paro had said several times, do not come and see me anymore. Al tosef ra'ot panai, whether perhaps there's even a play on the ra'ot panai of Paro and the ru'uta. Now it's true that you have the men also asking ish be'et re'eyu, so you have that as well. Again, there's more of an emphasis actually on the women in terms of the goods, because it mentions the smolot. So I don't know. It's a good point, but in point of fact, that's what the Chumash does say over here. That we can't deny. It's what it says. So apparently there was some, even in the most terrible times, there was some personal connections that were made. Plus, the Torah makes the point that with all these 9 plagues, the Israelites are becoming much more popular. Maybe the Egyptians see that God is on their side, and they're willing to give them gifts, and especially since the gifts perhaps suggest freeing them and getting them out of the country, because as they say later, who needs it? I mean, why should we die? Let's get them out of here. Wherever they go, we are dying. Is there anybody else who has a comment here?
I wanted to ask you, it's Debbie Suntime.
Yeah.
If the word Arabic comes up in other places, I know sometimes in Tehillim when we went through the Makot, I don't think it was called Arabic. I think it was called something else.
I'll tell you where you have this. You have it, again, I don't know if the word Arba is mentioned, but you have it in the book of Yoel. The first chapters of the book of Yoel describe a terrible infestation of various insects. I don't know if Arba is specifically mentioned over there, but you have it also mentioned in the Psalms, the Psalms that talk about the plagues.
Right.
You have Arba mentioned, at least in one of them. In the book of Yoel, in the first couple of chapters, there's a whole discussion of the various insects that will come. Yes, you do have it, by the way. I'll tell you.
I see
In
it.
the book of Yoel, in chapter 1, in verse number 4.
Aleph Dalet.
Yeter hagazal ochal ha'arbeh.
Right.
Yeter ha'arbeh ochal ha'yelek. Yeter ha'yelek ochal ha'chasil. So there it mentions different kinds of locusts. What the cutter, I don't know what these insects are. What the cutter has left, the locust devoured. What the locust has left, the grub has devoured. What the grub has left, the hopper has devoured. There's a terrible infestation. That's, of course, in the book of Yoel, which goes on and on. So that's, and of course, we know how devastating for an agricultural society, as the Egyptians said. I mean, the Barad also destroys crops. You have no food. You have no crops. So this is obviously a terrible, terrible plague, and it's described at great length throughout chapter 1 of the book of Yoel, for sure.
No, because every time I hear,
we'll just continue.
Every time I hear the word Arba, I think of the bracha, Arba, I will make you many, that Hashem has promised.
That's I don't know if it's a play. It's interesting, right? Harba Arba, right?
Right.
Maybe Dafka, I'm wondering whether Arba is related to that, because they come in swarms. It's not that one locust doesn't do anything. When we have in our own time, we've seen these infestations, which happen every 10, 15, 20 years. There are these amazing infestations. I remember many years ago, when used to run weekends on Simchat Torah and on Shavuot. We used to go away. Whole group went out to the mountains and learned there. It was very interesting. And one year there was a plague of gypsy moths, they were called. And you got to see this thing to believe it. I mean, you're walking on the ground, and you think you're walking on the ground, and you realize you're walking on these moths. I mean, billions of them. So it's really amazing to see this thing, to see the numbers, which are just staggering. And that's what, so maybe Arba is related to the idea of many, because it's not one locust, actually. It's the swarms, which are it's remarkable to see it. And the power within nature is just incredible. All right. So let us now continue. Let's continue with chapter 11. Fine. And now again, Moshe seems to be talking in the presence of Paro. Paro said, "Don't come back anymore. I'll tosef road panai." Vayelem Moshe. Again, Koamar Hashem, kachatzot halayla ani yotzei betoch Mitzrayim. Here they train kachatzot halayla towards evening. The Medrash makes the point, famously, that Moshe said kachatzot, which the Medrash takes means around midnight. And later, the play takes place bachatzi halayla, at midnight. Medrash famously says, because only God knows when exactly midnight is. The human being can sort of understand around midnight. Moshe didn't want to say at midnight. Paro might say, it didn't come at midnight, it came 5 minutes to 12. What are you talking about? So Moshe said to the Medrash, kachatzot. But it means towards evening. The Rashbam says, towards evening. Says God. Ani yotzei betoch Mitzrayim. Umei kol b'chor b'yeretz Mitzrayim, mibchor Paro hayoshev al kiso ad b'chor hashivcha asher achar rechayim b'chor behema v'aytot tzalkog adalo b'chor eretz Mitzrayim asher kamo lo niyata v'chamo lo sosef. So this is what Moshe is being told, and Moshe will convey this to Paro. God says, at midnight or towards midnight, I'll go forth among Egypt. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Paro, who sits on his throne, to the firstborn of the slave, who is behind the millstones, and the firstborn of the cattle. It affects human, it affects the animals. I just wanted to make one observation over here in this verse, which is the following. Later on in the Sefer Shemot, this I think is, I'm going to say something now, and it's something really to think about. Because it has, I think, there are other examples of this within the Torah. Later on in the Chumash, in Mishpatim, it has the various laws. The Parshas Mishpatim, there are a set of laws. I didn't want to talk about that a bit today, and we continue. We'll come to this hopefully someday and talk a lot more about it. But there are groups of laws. One of the main groups in the Torah is in Mishpatim, end of chapter 20, 21, 22, 23. You have groups of laws. One of the laws has to do with, let's say, for example, if an animal kills somebody, then there's a fine to be paid. And the Torah said, if your animal kills somebody, Obein yigach o bat yigach kamishpat hazeh yeyoselo. That's in chapter later on in Mishpatim. I don't have the verse right in front of me. Let's see if I can find that verse very quickly. Let's see. Yeah, here it is. That's in chapter 21, actually. I give this as an example. I want to make a point about this, just to put it out there for our thinking. It says if an animal gores a human being, and the human being dies, then the ox that killed the human being is stoned. Right? And Ubal Hashop, the owner of the ox, doesn't pay a fine. He's not key. He's not held accountable. My animal killed somebody. My animal is put to death, but I pay nothing. In the next verse, though, what about if this animal has a history of doing this? Not the first time. Then the Torah says the animal is put to death. V'gam ba'alav yumat, and the owner of the animal is also put to death. Maybe we will get there. We'll discuss it that way. Next verse says, "Im kofer yushat alav," but if ransom is laid upon the owner, ransom, v'natan pidyon, then he can pay money, k'chol asher yushat alav, whatever the amount is. Okay. Now, there's a whole conversation in the Gemara, because typically in the Torah, we don't find ransom. When someone commits a capital offense, you can't buy your way out of it. We don't have that in our tradition. In the other texts of the ancient Near East, you do have that. But one of the most interesting features of the Torah's laws is you don't have that. You can't buy your way out. If you kill a person, you're put to death, no money will help you. In this particular case, when my animal killed, okay, the animal, I didn't watch the animal, it's done it before. There the Torah speaks about kofar. I don't want to go there. And the assumption of the Gemara is there's always kofar. You never put the person to death because you can always pay ransom. Fine. The next verse is obein yigach or bat yigach, whether the animal killed a boy or a girl. Kamishpat hazeh ye'aseh lo. This is the rule, whether a boy or girl has been killed by the ox. And now the question is, why did the Torah say obein yigach or bat yigach? So many have interpreted it in the following way. The academics make this point, and that is when you look at other codes. I'm not sure it's Hammurabi. We have several codes of the ancient Near East, Hammurabi's code and others. When you look at the other codes, they point out that in the other codes, if my ox killed someone's child, okay, then in those other codes, my child is killed. And what the Torah is saying is, unlike the Hammurabi laws and other codes, this is different. The child is never killed. What it says in Devarim, lo yumtu avot abanim ubanim lo yumtu alavot ish becheto yumatu. What it says in Sefer Devarim, the child is not killed for the parent's sins. So the father was negligent, and he killed someone's child, someone's baby, someone's child. In the other codes, your child is killed. But in the Torah's code, that's not the case. Whatever the rule is for the adult, it doesn't matter. It's just a monetary payment. If it happened before, then you pay a ransom. But that's the rule. Now, why do I mention this here? Verses in chapter 21 of Sefer Mishpatim over here. And what I want to simply point out is that I think that the Torah in different places distinguishes between divine justice or divine behavior on one hand and human behavior on the other. Because over here, we have exactly this point. In fact, we had it earlier in the Torah when Moshe is first going down to Egypt. And God says to Moshe, Moshe's already agreed to go, he's on the way down. Remember what God said to Moshe? God says to Moshe, B'ni b'chori Yisrael. Israel is my firstborn child. So you tell Paro, it's all back in chapter 4, you tell Paro that if you don't let them go, Hinei anochi horei get b'necha b'chorecha, I will kill your firstborn child. Now, according to the men who interpret chapter 21, that's exactly what the Torah says you don't do. It's exactly. The Torah says, obein yigach or bat yigach, if my animal killed your child, kamishpat hazeh yeyaseh lo, you follow the above rule. What is the above rule? You kill the ox and the owner gets off free. And if I have a record of this kind of behavior, then I am put to death, but I can be ransomed through money. And that rule applies if it kills an adult or it kills a child. That's what the Torah says. That's on the human level. But when it comes to God's behavior, it's exactly not so, right? So go and tell Paro that I'm going to go pass through Egypt and kill all of the firstborn. And earlier, the Torah justified that by saying, tell Paro, B'ni b'chori Yisrael, I am, Israel is my firstborn child. I'm going to kill your firstborn child. It's exactly what the Torah says we don't do. We don't do it. Our judgment's not that way, but God's judgment is different. So that's interesting. And the question would be, are there other such examples where human justice says one thing, but God operates in a different way? Let me give you one other example. I think that I was just thinking about this the last couple of days, about God's behavior and human behavior. We talk about we try imitating God, but actually we don't imitate God necessarily. God has certain freedoms we don't have. Let me give you another example of this, just to put it out there, and then we'll resume our study here of the chapter 11. And that is, the Torah has the following law. The Torah says in the book of Devarim that if a man divorces his wife, okay, man divorces his wife, the Torah says a man may divorce his wife. And the Torah says, and then what happened was she married somebody else. So the couple gets divorced and the woman marries somebody else. Says the Torah that the first husband and then the second husband, that doesn't work out. Now she's divorced from the second husband. So the Torah says, Lo yuchal ba'ala harishon lashuv l'kachta. The first husband is not allowed to take her back. Acharei asher hu tamah. This is a terrible thing. He's not allowed to take back his previous wife if she married, in the interim, she married somebody else. That's known in the rabbinic literature as the prohibition of machazir gerushato. You're not permitted to take her back. And actually, this rule of machzir gerushato is actually alluded to in the book of Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu says, if a man divorced his wife, can he take her back again? Now they can get remarried if she didn't marry somebody else. But she married somebody else, right? And the God says, and you have forsaken me, and you've gone into so many other lovers, etc. So it sounds like, just as in human law, there's a prohibition to remarry the ex-wife who's married somebody else. So it sounds like God has the same rules. The only thing is, when you read the Chumash, it's exactly the opposite. Because what the Chumash speaks about in the Tochacha that appears in Sefer Devarim, we read the Tochacha in the book of Vayikra, is even a longer one in Sefer Devarim, and that one ended, but the last verse was that God will send you back in Egypt. God will send you back to Mitzrayim in boats. That's the last verse of the admonition in chapter 28 of Sefer Devarim. Sounds like it's hopeless. Then you read 2 chapters later, no matter how far you've strayed, Hashevota eluvavecha, ki yashuv Hashem, v'shav Hashem, v'shav Hashem, 7 times to return. So you've forsaken God, you've abandoned God, you've betrayed God, you've broken the covenant. God has sent you back to Mitzrayim. Go back to Mitzrayim, and then, no matter where you are, in the farthermost corners of heaven, you can always come back. No matter what's happened, no matter how far you've strayed, you can always return. And it strikes me that the very use of the word lashuv in Sefer Devarim is exactly this point. It may be on the human level that once the marriage didn't work out, married somebody else, lo yuchal ba'ala harishon lashuv l'kachta. He can't take her back. But that's as far as the human is concerned. But God operates with a different set of rules. No matter how far you've strayed, no matter how much you've betrayed, no matter whatever, from the divine standpoint, you can always come back. Yashuv Hashem, etc. So I'm just thinking, these 2 cases struck me, and I was reading this before, and we take for granted the plague of the firstborn. It's exactly what the Torah says the human can't do. The human can't mete out justice to the child because my child was harmed. Or ben yigach or bat yigach. It's exactly what God does in Mitzrayim. I think what the Chumash is suggesting that is, what we have to think about this, is the distinction between divine justice on one hand and human justice on the other. We can't operate that way. God may operate that way. We don't. And I give you the other example from the other side, where God actually can always take you back. We can't always take back, but God can always take. Okay, I thought that was an interesting observation. Okay, let us now.
So another example with a pshat is Poked Avon Avot.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly Poked Avon.
That's the obvious.
Exactly. There the Torah says that's a similar point actually to the firstborn. There is that God, at least in the description. Of course, Chazal deal with that in other ways, but in the description, as you say, God can visit the sin of the children of the parents upon the children. And the Torah says explicitly, lo yimtu avot abanim, ubanim lo yimtu alavot, that we're actually enjoined from doing that. And that's related to what I said about the firstborn. We don't, I cited the verse in Mishpatim, o ben yigach o bat yigach, but your point is well taken. So there's, again, God has God's rules and we have our rules. The question is the connection between them, but this is I thought, an interesting observation. Okay, now let's continue that with chapter 11, and I want to make one other point about chapter 11 here.
Do you have a quick insight as to why you think those levels of justice are different? Is it because God's trying to teach man to be more merciful, or?
I think in the case of the firstborn, I'm not sure God's more merciful. I mean, I don't have a quick insight. I just point out the difference between them. I think that I would say that we don't have the right. I would say that we don't have the right to make those kinds of judgments, to make those kind of equivalences, etc. From our standpoint, we deal with every person as they are. So yeah, perhaps that's what it is. Again, I'm simply pointing out the difference between them. I'm not getting to the specifics of it, but I think this observation that the Torah has gone out of its way, as it were, to say that we can't do this within this very book, I think is rather striking. But more than that, I really don't have anything to say at this point. I would welcome someone has some observations or other examples of it. I think that would be, I mentioned 2 examples. And the Pokeda Bonavot is a similar idea, of course. Let me make one other point over here about chapter 11.
Maybe we could say
Yes.
Haniglot lanu v'hanistarot l'Hashem, that it teaches us that we should be humble when we try to attribute or try to explain what occurs here on earth, how God, the machinations of God, or when
Right.
When things happen, why did October 7th happen and this and that? We're human beings. We can think about it, but we can't definitively say this happened because of this or that. We don't understand.
Of course, we're limited in our ability to see. Sometimes after the fact, we can figure it out, but it's also very hard to predict, what's going to happen. Clearly, we are not God. That's clear. I mean, but I just pointed out that I think this is a glaring. With this Makat B'Charot is something. It's the ultimate plague. It's recalled in all of our prayers. I mean, we're constantly mentioning Makat B'Charot. It's mentioned in Hodu. It's mentioned in the blessing after the Shema, in both in the morning and the evening. It's mentioned all the time. Makat B'Charot is very central, and it's the last plague, and it's that which allows us, and that forces power when the Egyptians to free us. I'm just saying the Torah later on says that you can't do that, and God made the equivalence in chapter 4. Tell Paro, B'ni b'chori Yisrael, Israel is my firstborn. Don't let them go. I'm going to kill your firstborn, and not just your firstborn, the firstborn of Mitzrayim. It's actually explicit. That's what's so striking. It's actually explicit. All right, let me make one last point over here about our chapter 11, and this is, I think, again, it's a point I think that is important for us, not just for chapter 11, but something to think about in our study of the Chumash in general. You have over here, apparently God is speaking to Moshe in the presence of Paro. Paro had said, "You can't come see me anymore." And Moshe says, "I'm not going to come to you anymore." Now later on, actually, it's Paro that calls Moshe. So Moshe never goes to Paro again, but rather it's going to be Paro going to Moshe. Fine. So here we have, and again, towards the middle and end of chapter 11, it's a very brief chapter. Again, Ko Amar Hashem, it sounds like Moshe's hearing this in Pharaoh's court, and is going to relay to Paro what God says, and the warning is about Makat B'Chorot. Right? It's going to happen to Mitzrayim, and in the 7th pasuk, U'Lechol B'nei Yisrael, or Yecheratz Kelev Rishono, V'meish V'yad Behemah, U'man Teidun, Asher Yafra Hashem, Bein Mitzrayim U'Bein Yisrael. Okay, so the question is, as far as Mitzrayim is concerned, there'll be devastation amongst all all the firstborn of the humans and also the animals, and all the humans, regardless of their station, Pharaoh's firstborn, and even the one in jail, etc. It doesn't matter. But as far as Israel is concerned, there's going to be a cry amongst the Egyptians, right? In verse number 6, there'll be a great cry amongst the Egyptians. There'll be a great screaming and crying, a cry we've never heard before. Kamo loto safe. Never heard of such a cry before, and never again will there be such a cry. That's as far as Mitzrayim. Ulachol b'nei Yisrael, but as far as Israel is concerned, yecharatz kelev lishono. What does it mean? Yecharatz kelev lishono. So let's see. Here the translation. It's very not clear what this means. The translation I have, and I think you have the same translation. No dog, not a dog, shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast. That is possible. In other words, they'll be screaming and screaming and screaming about the plague that the Egyptians are suffering. But as far as Israel is concerned, there'll be no screaming. There'll be no screaming. There'll be no adversary. Even a dog. Even a dog will not snarl. So this interpretation means that, the dogs snarl. Sometimes dogs snarl or whatever before they attack you. There's not going to be even that. There's going to be no danger, and no sense of kind of impending danger. That's certainly possible. That's a possibility. That Yecharatz L'shono describes snarling, which could precede some kind of attack, but that's not going to happen. I was thinking something else, actually. Maybe this is completely off base, so I'm not going to solely argue strenuous, but I wondered whether, sometimes those who have dogs know that sometimes when someone comes to your door, if you have a dog, and the dog starts to bark, actually, or even growl, because dogs are there to actually, nowadays, many people have dogs, and there's a very strong bond between the human and the dog. The dog sees the dog's obligation to protect its master. People have dogs because the stranger comes to the house, the dog starts barking, and the dog starts threatening. So I was wondering, it's taken typically to mean the dog's not going to snarl, that is to say, the dog's not going to attack you. Not even the dog will attack you. But I was wondering whether it means something else. The destroying angel will go out amongst Mitzrayim, but the destroying angel is not going to be near you, because if the destroying angel would come near you, maybe the dog will start barking, snarling at this force that's coming towards you, maybe to protect you, maybe to protect the dog itself. Who knows? Either way, what it's saying is, as far as Mitzrayim is, we had this before. Mitzrayim will be under threat. There'll be terrible suffering and terrible crying out. And amongst Israel, there will be the silence. No, once again, a distinction being drawn as it's explicit. Fine. And then Moshe continues. Not only that, but your own servants, so he's talking to Paro. Your servants will come to me. You said I shouldn't go to you. Your servants will come to me and bow down to me, saying, leave. You and your people should leave, and then I will leave, which happens later on, because it's not just the Pharaoh who says you can leave, as we pointed out before, it's Mitzrayim that says, get out. And then Moshe walks out from Paro, and Moshe left Paro presence with great anger. This is the description. Now the question is, when is Moshe saying this? When is Moshe saying? What day is Moshe saying this? So here the commentaries are divided. When is Moshe saying that it's going to be the death of the firstborn? So it takes us back to verse number 4. Vayomer Moshe kol amar Hashem kachatzot halayla ani yotzei betoch Mitzrayim. Towards midnight, I will go out in Mitzrayim. Which midnight? So some commentaries say Moshe said midnight, but he didn't say which midnight. That's actually very strange if you think about it, right? Because Kachatzot Halayla sounds like he's talking in the morning, and he says to Paro, towards midnight tonight. The other plagues have very specific warnings. Tomorrow, this, that. Is this a plague with no warning? Or is this a plague which is saying it's going to happen tonight? It's now 8 o'clock in the morning. Paro goes out early in the morning. Moshe's standing in Pharaoh's presence in the court in the morning, midday, whatever. Tonight, the firstborn will die. And amongst the Jews, there won't be a problem. The firstborn will die. That's what it sounds like to me that it's talking about. He's telling it's going to happen not machar, not tomorrow, but tonight at midnight. Kachatzot halayla. And God says to Moshe at the end of chapter 11, Paro's not going to listen to you. And in verse number 10, it gives sort of it reminds us, it recalls all the plagues that have happened till now. That Moshe and Aaron it summarizes what happened in the past, all those other plagues, and we expect next the 10th plague, the last plague. 10 is the number of completion, and it's going to happen Kachatzot halayla, which is a perfectly reasonable interpretation, except for one thing. This is a little chapter 11, and now we have chapter 12. And chapter 12 does not begin with the plague of the firstborn. The plague of the firstborn, the carrying out of the plague of the firstborn, takes place in chapter 12, verse number 29. It's 29 verses down the road. And what do we have? What do we have in the first 28 verses of chapter 12? Here we have the Korban Pesach. Here we have a Chodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodeshim, and when we resume, whenever that will be, we, of course, will start with chapter 12, which is the first mitzvah that is given to the Jewish people. In the simple reading of the Chumash, it's the Korban Pesach. And the Korban Pesach is such a special sacrifice. And the Korban Pesach, when is the command given about the Korban Pesach? So it's going to be in the first month, the month of Nisan. This is the first month. But in chapter 12, of course, we all remember that Moshe is to tell the people they are to choose a Korban Pesach on the 10th day of the month. And they get to watch this Korban Pesach on the 10th day of the month. They are to slaughter the Korban Pesach on the 14th day of the month. And they are to eat the Korban Pesach that night. In other words, if we assume, which is the plain reading of the Chumash, that the chapter 11, Moshe is talking to Paro it would be the 14th, on the 14th day of the month, because that night is going to be the plague of the firstborn, which is the night of, we call the 15th. Let's say the day starts at night. So the midnight of the 15th, there's going to be the plague, the Makat B'chamo, which is described in verse number 29. What it means is that the Torah has interrupted its story. And it's not in chronological order, because in chronological order, the command of the Korban Pesach would precede chapter 11, because the command of the Korban Pesach has got to be before the 10th day of the month, because they're told to take the animal on the 10th day of the month. And this raises the question, why? Why does the Torah interpose these first 28 verses, the rule of the Korban Pesach, before we get to Makat B'charot? Maybe that's how we can begin when we resume, but I want to make a different point, which is a very general point about the Chumash, and something you really have to think about in a study of Torah, which is, when you think about the Torah, let's think about the 5 books of Moses, the Torah, okay? The Torah, for the most part, I mean, Sefer Devarim feels very different, but let's say even the first 4 books. When you think about the Torah consists of stories, and the Torah consists of various rules. I think it's fair to say that the majority of the Torah is actually stories. Almost the entire book of Breshit is stories. There's only 1 or 2 mitzvot in the book. Sefer Shemot is a long story. But there are sections of the Torah, independent sections, where there are laws. For example, in Mishpatim, these 3 chapters or 4 chapters is a set of laws. In Vayikra, we have Kedoshim. In Sefer Dvarim, we have Parshat Shoftim and Kitetze, etc. But for the most part, they're stories. But sometimes, and this you have really in Sefer Bamidbar, sometimes it's not so much that you have separate laws and stories, but sometimes the stories and the laws are actually interconnected. So that, for example, in Sefer Shmot, in Parshat Mishpatim, there you have a separate section of laws. You have the 10 Commandments in chapter 20, you have the end of 20, 21, 22, 23. Those are a whole bunch of laws. It's a set of laws. But in other places, especially in the book of Bamidbar, but here in Sefer Shemot as well, in the story of the Exodus from Egypt, and this is what is very interesting, that the Torah has interrupts the story of Makat Bechorot and tells us, goes back in time actually, to include the rules of the Korban Pesach, this 28, and it will do this later on as well on 2 other occasions within the Exodus story itself. And that's something to think about, and maybe when we resume, we will discuss this. Why is it so? And what is the power and what is the significance of interrupting your story? And in this case, it's very striking because it's actually out of chronological order, of interrupting the story with the Korban Pesach. What kind of light does it shed upon this whole story of the Exodus, this formative story? These are the beginnings of the Jewish people. And the Torah interrupted its story of Makat Bechorot, which it picks up in chapter 29 at verse 29. And verse 29 is very, very parallel to what we read in chapter 11. So the parallel stories, it would be a perfect fulfillment of what Moshe says to Paro in chapter 11. But the Torah has interrupted it. So I want to discuss that, the import, the significance of having this Chodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim and the Korban Pesach interrupt the Exodus narrative. What does it add to our understanding? So again, we've had an opportunity these weeks to study together. Sorry, I can't see anybody here, but in any event, and I very much look forward to continuing. Hope we get more people involved in our learning together, and looking forward to continuing the story. And yeah, as Rashi, the first Rashi in Chumash says, the Torah should have begun, says Rashi, quotes the Medrash, with chapter 12 of the book of Exodus, with a Chodesh, the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people. Where we continue our study together, that will be the beginning of our study. If anybody has any comments or questions now, we have a couple of minutes. Is anybody there? Now I can actually see people, believe it or not.
Oh, good.
Okay. I don't know what happened.
Wait,
but,
I do have a question. This is Naomi.
go ahead.
Can you
Yes.
explain the form of the nihyata, v'hayata? Why the nun? What's it saying there?
Which verse do you have in mind?
It
Oh,
was,
yeah, that verse, which never happened before or after, that one?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, in verse number, was it 5 or 6? 6. I mean, to me, we had a very similar statement about in plague number 7. Such a thing never happened from the time that Egypt was formed until this day.
But
I
it
don't
could
have any
just
great
say
wisdom
hello,
to say.
hayata kacha. You don't need that strange form.
Yeah, right. It's niyata, so a form of nihiyah. I mean, I think the point about Makat Bechorot is this. Makat Bechorot is a punishment, and it's in the other 9 plagues, Moshe and Aaron play some kind of role. When it comes to the 10th plague, they play no role whatsoever. God will go out amongst Mitzrayim. I think the point over here of emphasizing it's never happened before is to underscore the unique nature of Makat Bechorot. It's something that no human being was involved with at all, not Moshe, not Aaron. And it actually fits in very nicely to what I said before about God operates in a way different from the human. In this particular plague, There's only God involved. There's no human input whatsoever. I mean, there are preparations for it, that we'll talk about, but the actual plague itself is carried out wholly by God. So here the idea is this is something unique. And I'll come back to that point that you're making, because I think it's actually a very important point in terms of understanding sort of the bigger picture of why this is so special, and why the Korban Pesach is so significant, and why it interrupts the narrative. But when we begin our study, I'll begin with your comment about Kamo Lo Niyata. And actually I have more to say about the verse, which I can't do now, but hopefully when we continue, I will remember to address it, because it's actually a very important point. But again, once again, it's God and only God is involved in this particular plague. Okay, I think I have to stop at this point. Again, thank you all for participating. If you have any other questions, you can always email me. I'm in Israel now. I'm planning to return to the States tomorrow, and back and forth, and looking forward to opportunities to learn together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Silber.
When is our next class?
Thank you.
I don't know exactly. You got to notice. I think it's later in June, maybe towards the end of June. There'll be a series of 5 more. I think towards the end of June, towards the end of July, we're going to have more classes.
Thank you.
Okay, then.
Looking forward.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. And looking forward to starting again. In any case, after Shavuot, but the Sphere Zman is still going on. This afternoon at 1 p.m. We're learning Mishnah Sota with Rabbi Avi Wallfish. It'll be the last in that series, and I'm really looking forward. The last chapter of Sota is really enigmatic, and I'm really excited for his take on it. So hope to see you there. Good afternoon.